Ehe gar utosi. For that's the way it is. Thus, it has. Idiomatic expression, often translated as the equivalent of a me plus a predicate adjective. But it isn't, because it's third person, impersonal, rather than first person, personal. So how can they be equivalent? That's another example of the need to learn the original. Now, I, so nunego proton epi dikasterion anabebeca. Now, I, we know right away it's the subject, don't we? Proton, first, in this case, for the first time, epi dikasterion, to the rostrum, or metonymically to a court of law, have ascended, gone up. Now, I, for the first time, have ascended to the rostrum. Ete gegonos hebdomekonta, being, or having become, 70 years old. Now, verbs of being and becoming don't take direct objects, do they? So how are you going to reconcile this accusative? Well, here we have what, if it were a direct object, would be double underlined, but I'm putting it in parentheses because it's a different kind of accusative. It's an accusative of respect, with respect to 70 years. I have become with respect to 70 years. Okay? But that's kind of weird in English, so understand that what's really going on here is that the blurriness between a direct object and an adverb, and the fact that they really are the same thing, and here's a video in which I say that, and you may find interesting to complement this point. I have become 70 years. I am 70 years old. I have 70 years old. You see how fluid these notions are? That's something you need to internalize. The more accusatives that aren't direct objects you encounter, the more capable you'll become at doing that. Atechnosun xenos echotes in thade lexeos. Unskillfully, therefore, as a stranger, I have, just let's do literal first, here, of this way of thinking. I have, as a stranger, of this way of speaking. Now, in English, that's terrible because it's an idiomatic phrase, just like the gegonos, hebdomekonta ete, etc. So understand what's going on here. Unskillfully, in other words, simply, without techne, without art, in the pejorative sense of a sophist, for example. Therefore, without skill, I, as a stranger, have or hold or am possessed, right, here of this way of speaking. I am a stranger, we might say, to this way of speaking. Now, it's genitive going with the echo in this particular construction that the commentary asks you to look at in Smythe, and I suggest you do. But do remember that every preposition means with respect to, so let's try that. I have as a stranger with respect to this way of speaking. Interesting, right? It's almost like something you would expect Spock to say, but it makes sense in a weird way, doesn't it? That is called beginning to internalize ancient Greek. You see? Hosper un an e to onti xenos e tunkianon on synegignoskete depu an moi e inekene te phonete kai to tropo elegon. In hosper e te thramen on, anticipatory on, is going to be answered by this on. So this on kind of prepares you for this on in a present country to fact condition with an imperfect verb. In English, we're not going to be translating this, but we're going to take it as anticipatory. Thus, therefore, on eto onti xenos etu kianon on. If, and then the to onti, don't be scared by it. It's a dative of respect, so as if, therefore, I were indeed happening to be a stranger. Sune gignoskete, you would indeed, this on answering to the previous one, have sympathy for me, with respect to me. If, here's your protasis of a present contraried condition, if in that voice and manner I were to speak in which I had been raised, pluperfect, from Trefo. Kai de kai, nun tuto himon deomai dikaion. And indeed, also, now that I ask of you as something just, or justly, if you will. This is a good example of how kai sometimes means and other times means also. And indeed also, not and indeed and, because that's redundant, isn't it? Nice, huh? So for an ancient Greek, there's a capacity to look at kai twice and think two different things about it despite it being the same word, whereas in English, if we saw and, indeed, and, we would see nothing but two ands. So therefore, the first kai is a conjunction, the second is an adverb. Nun tuto himon deomai dikaion. Hos gemoi doko, as it seems to me. Now, supposedly this is synonymous with doke, it seems to me to be the case, hos. Well, it says I seem, so I seem to me to be thus. Ton men tropon tes lexeos eon. Okay, so what is it that Socrates is asking for? I ask, or beg, sometimes, of you, this. Here we go again with the this, right? Now, this. Direct object. I ask of you this just thing, as it seems to me. Namely, now here's the tricky part, the isos men gar hieron, isos de beltion an eie, is one parenthetical statement that threatens to disrupt the flow of the sentence for one approaching it for the first time. Let's not let that happen. Whether what I say is worse or better, the ton men tropon tes lexeos eion auto de tutos scopain. That's the flow. We have a men deconstruction, isos all the same. Isos with the omicron means equal or same. So when it's turned into an adverb, all the samely, if you will, on the one hand. I ask of you all this just thing, as it seems to me. Namely, ton men tropon tes lexeos eon. So I ask of you this thing that seems just to me. On the one hand, ton men tropon tes lexeos eon, to suffer this way of speaking, eon, infinitive. Looks like if with the subjunctive coming up, but it isn't. Aute de tuto. On the other hand, auto, this thing to look at, and ton nun prosechein, hold your mind toward your mind, to hold. Do you see how, whether we have the ton nun as a direct object of pros echein, or pros ton nun as a prepositional phrase qualifying echein, they come to about the same thing. There's another example of how the direct object and the prepositional phrase are both adverbial. You see that? Okay. On the other hand, I ask this, thing I consider to be just of you, to look at this thing and to hold out your mind to it. If I speak just things, say just things, or not. You see that? So all I ask of you is that you consider whether or not what I say is just, irrespective of how good or bad at it, of how, whether it's better or worse in speech. And this goes all the way back to this notion of atechnos. He just speaks things simply in his own way. And this just thing that he asks of you, in the plural, is men and day, this and this. That you go easy on, that you allow this way of speaking, whether it sucks or is good. On the other hand, to look at this thing, to consider this thing, and put your mind toward it, namely, whether or if I say just things or not. Dikastumen gar haute arete, retoros de talethe legain. For this, esti implied, is the arete, the honor, dikastu, of the judge. On the other hand, of the rhetor, of the rhetorician, of the speaker, to say true things. So you have this haute pointing back to this request on Socrates' part. The lack of the esti emphasizes the identicality of the haute and the arete. This, the honor of the judge, on the one hand, on the other hand, of the rhetor, this is the honor. What is? Talethe legain, to speak the truth. Okay? So the judge, his job, his or her, well, in ancient Athens, definitely his job is to decide between true and false. The rhetor, the orator, the job of the orator, on the other hand, is to say true things. Okay, so the judge needs to decide between two rhetors, orators, lawyers, who is speaking the truth and who isn't. All right, so we have another men-day construction, men and day, and you see how, although men and day are often not translated into English, at least in most classes, they serve not only to underscore a contrast, but to organize the sentence. On the one hand, all of this stuff. On the other hand, all of this stuff. Without the men in the day, you would have a solid of words, not organized in this way. So it helps to clarify things in that manner. Okay. First, proton, men on the one hand, therefore. Dikaiosemi, and the lack of accent on emi doesn't mean it means to go, because you don't have the circumflex over the first iota, but rather that the dikaios swallows up what would be the ultimate accent of emi. It just means, I am just to answer, O Athenian men, pros ta prota mu sude, categore mena kaitus protus categorus. I am just to answer, O Athenian men, to answer to the first false category mena, accusations of me, and pros, toward the first accusers. On the other hand, de, epeta, then, pros, toward ta husteron, the category mena, husteron, the later accusations, or accusations delivered later, and tus husterus, and the accusers later, the later accusers. Okay, so the later accusations and the later accusers. For poloi kategoroi emu, for many accusers of me, gigonasi pros humas kai palai pola ede ete kai uden alethes legontes, have arisen toward you, and already for many years, a long time now, and saying nothing true. Hus ego malon phobumai e tu samphi anuton kai perontas kai tutus denus, whom I more fear than those around Anitus, although untas kai tutus denus, these men also being terrible. But ekenoi denoteroi, O Andres, hoi, but those are more terrible, O men, O Athenian men, hoi himon tus polus ek paidon para lambanontes epe thon, te kai kategorun imu malon uden alethes. But those are more terrible, O men, who of you tus polus, the many, from childhood, from the time of childhood, genitive of source, who of you, the many, from childhood, paralambanontes, taking aside, para, beside, lambanontes, taking, persuaded you, to accuse me of nothing more true, that is, than what they said Anitus did. Hosistintis Socrates, that estintis Socrates, that there is a certain Socrates, a wise man, a sophos aner. Sophos, a weighty word here, semantically speaking, because we know that philosophy means love of wisdom, but here there's an ironic twinge to the word sophos, meaning one who claims to be wise, a wise man, this guy who thinks he's so wise. And as the commentary points out, there's a link here with the idea of sophistry, or a sophist, what he does, according to Socrates himself, calling the true false and the false true. And as Aristophanes points out in his Clouds, as Aristophanes accuses Socrates himself of doing in his Clouds, tate meteora frontistes, a thinker about the things above, and seeking out, searching for. The zate is a big root meaning to seek things out. Seeking out kai, ta hypoges panta, kai. So we have both this and that. Kai ... kai ... Both, all things under the earth, and ton heto logon, and making the lower word better. Okay? The lesser word better, the inferior word better. All right? So that's what Socrates is most upset about, is being accused of, first of all, thinking of himself as wise, and we know from the famous story of him going around and seeking from the oracle at Delphi who is the wisest man in the world, and finding out that he is, because he knows that he knows nothing, whereas everyone else thinks they know something. The irony here of being accused of thinking of himself as the very thing that he is convinced he is the wisest man in the world for not thinking of himself as, and being accused of thinking about higher things, esoteric things, if you will, and seeking out extensively all the things under the earth, and making, the same verb as poetizing, making the lesser word better. Hutoi, o Andres Athenaioi, hoi tauten ten themein, kataskedasantes, hoidenoi eisen mu kategoroi. All right, so let's start allowing ourselves to jump around a little in our interpretation. Let's start looking for obvious things, such as all of this is obviously nominative. Hoi de noyesen mu kategoroi. These are the terrible accusers of me. These are the terrible accusers of me, kataskedasantes. Having whatted? Having something, even if you don't know the meaning of this word, tautentain fame, fama in Latin, reputation, okay, kataskedasantes. Now, if you know Homer, you know that this root here is one that means scatter. So scattering around, scattering about. This reputation, right? So, hutoi, these, O Athenian men, who scattering around this fama, this reputation, hoi isen mu kategoroi denoi, are the terrible accusers of me.